Toxic leaders, they're everywhere. In fact, they're not even worth being referred to as leaders. Instead, I like to refer to them as bosses. These horrible examples of leadership are all too often the result in people quitting their jobs and organizations crumbling. Today, my guest Mark Tinsley and I discuss topics such as what toxic leadership really is, where toxic leaders come from, how organizations can ensure they pick people who will be successful leaders, how leaders can check to see if they're a toxic leader, amongst many other topics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, episode 112, Toxic Leadership with Mark Tinsley. Welcome all to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. It's your Chief Leadership Officer, Scott McCarthy, and welcome to the podcast focused on the three domains of leadership: leading yourself, leading your team, and leading your organization, with the goal to help you get promoted quicker, build those deeper connections within your teams, and help your organization boast its bottom line, whatever that bottom line may look like. And here, we're all about helping you, the leader. So thanks for coming out. Today we're going to couple Army officers experience between myself and Mark Tinsley. You see, Mark's a U.S. Army officer and leadership coach and consultant, much like myself. But he's been through so many poor examples of leadership and so many examples of toxic leader. He's embarked on a journey to help the world rid of toxic leadership. And now he's helping organizations, large and small, to get rid of toxicity from their workplace and instead instill leadership within their ranks. So it's a great show today, folks. You get two Army officers talking about leadership, talking about the poor examples of leadership that we've seen in the past, but most importantly, how to ensure that you don't have it within your ranks, because we've seen it all too often in ours. And it's such an important topic for us to talk about this day and age, because there are just so many examples out there of poor leaders, hypocritical bosses. And you know what? I know you don't want to be one. So this is how you can make sure you don't become one. And in fact, how you can make sure that if you do have one within your organization, what you can do about it. So you know what? I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation about toxic leadership with Mark Tinsley. Mark, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. Great to have you here.
Thanks, man. It's good to be here.
So we're talking about an epically important and kind of disheartening topic, I will put it, and that's toxic leadership.
Absolutely.
So for you, how do you take as toxic leadership? What is toxic leadership?
I mean, I think toxic leadership is any kind of leadership that either harms the followers emotionally, spiritually, obviously physically, or inhibits the organization from reaching its goals and its mission. I think toxic leadership, oftentimes we think toxic leadership is something overt and intentional, as in aggressive leadership, hateful attitudes, those types of things. But toxic leadership can also be just failing to do the things that a leader needs to do. Leaders can be toxic when they don't lead well, when they don't motivate their subordinates. Again, anything that harms the individual followers or the organization as a whole and corporately, I think can be labeled as toxic. So it's a really general term in my mind. It's not something that has one particularized definition, but it's a large, broad type of issue.
Yeah. It was interesting way you kind of described it there, because you kind of had two different types of leaders come out. One I wouldn't even call a leader. I like to refer to them as bosses in moving forward leadership. And that is that negative persona the one that just wants to get ahead, that will destroy whatever's in their way or around them to get better. And the other one is the person who thinks they're doing okay, but really isn't. They don't mean to do harm, but in reality is they are doing harm.
Right.
So what are the sources for these guys, these leaders out there? How do they even become leaders in the first place?
I think we have a low standard for leadership in our country. I think a lot of times we think that it's someone who has the proper credentials and or experience can suddenly and reasonably be a leader. And I think leadership is so much more than that. Leadership involves things other than academic credentials and experience. It involves things like character, resiliency, grace, mercy, common sense. I mean, a leader is so many more things than his or her credentials and what they've done with their lives. But that's how we define it. I grew up, a lot of my leadership was in higher education. And suddenly when someone in U.S. higher education, Western higher education, you have a PhD, suddenly everyone assumes you could be the dean or the president of the university. Well, that's just not the case in so many instances. I mean, I'll say this because I've been in academic circles. Academicians oftentimes are your worst leaders. And so credentials don't make the leader. It's so many more inherent and innate things that make a leader. I always like how the medical profession operates in leadership oftentimes. They don't think because you have an MD or MD PhD that you're going to suddenly be the best medical director. In fact, most medical directors are people with far fewer credentials, master's degrees in many cases, because they've come up in a different area. They're leading in the medical profession, but they're not necessarily the medical doctors and the academicians in the medical field. They're people who've grown up in a different track, but have proven, in many cases, hopefully, have proven their business acumen and their leadership abilities. And so they're the ones placed in leadership, not necessarily the people who are experts in that area of medicine. So I've often said in academics that we should have a similar track, that there should be people who run the universities should be people who are specialized in those areas, not necessarily the academics who've worked their way up. But I'm not everybody agrees with me in that.
Unfortunately, that's often the case, right?
Yeah.
We see things clear because we're kind of from the outside looking in. And unfortunately, those who are on the inside get very defensive when you start saying, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that job.
There's always exceptions, Scott. I mean, I'm not making a blanket statement, as you probably can assume. I mean, it's obviously there are great people with credentials that are great leaders, but I think we oftentimes look to those letters after the name as evidence of leadership ability, and that's just not. It's so often not the case. Leaders are so much more. Leadership is so much more. Yeah.
So often, as you were discussing, toxic leaders come from the lack of, experience, lack of training, lack, or ego due to training and education, but not necessarily in the right fields. So how do we go about ensuring we mitigate that, right? Ensuring that we don't necessarily pick just the person that has the most letters next to their name, but the one who actually has the capacity, the competency, and potential to be successful in that leadership role within our organization.
Well, I think obviously that you've got to look at competence above everything else. I mean, some of your greatest leaders are not necessarily, again, experts in the fields that they're leading in. They're just great innovators, great thinkers. They think outside the box. They know how to motivate people and get people going. I mean, I think about the NASA space program. A lot of the people who led the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions put people on the moon in 1969 weren't necessarily engineers in the aerospace field. They were just people that knew how to motivate engineers in the aerospace field. They had competencies in leadership. And so I think first and foremost, we need to look beyond credentials. We need to look beyond kind of the litmus tests we have in the West of have you done the right things and have the right education, and look at, okay, where does this person actually have competency in leadership? You find that out by watching people. You find that out by seeing how people interact with other folks. And so leaders today need to look for their replacements tomorrow. So leaders for tomorrow, and not just look, okay, so and so is the associate now, so obviously they need to be the primary, the president or whatever when I'm gone. No, not necessarily. Look for the person below that's coming up that has the leadership capability and competencies. Beyond that, I think most organizations do a very poor job. I include organizations that are oftentimes touted as some of the greatest leadership training organizations in the world, like here in the U.S., our U.S. military. People say, oh, that's the best training ground in the world for leadership. And in many ways it is. But having been an officer in the United States Army, I can tell you that that most of your training is just OJT. There's professional development. Don't get me wrong. There's professional development training along the way. But so much of it is just by the school of hard knocks. I remember so many times being thrown into leadership positions, and I was never given any training whatsoever into that position. I was just told, here's your ticket, now go. And I think the Army does a much better job than most organizations in training its leaders, and they don't even do, in my opinion, the greatest job. So I think what more organizations need to do is formalized and informalized training of young leaders, people that are coming up. Mentorship, I think, is huge, and that's something that is missing so much. Mentoring young leaders in small groups, one-on-one mentorship, those types of things, and kind of teaching them through the shoulder-to-shoulder, arm around your shoulder approach, how to be a leader, how to be a person, how to show grace when grace is needed, how to drop the hammer sometimes when you need to drop the hammer. I think a lot of people are coming into positions and they just have never had any real mentoring. And then the third thing I would say, Scott, so looking for competencies, mentorship and training. And then thirdly, would be not pushing people into leadership roles too soon. I think I see this more and more and more and more as we go on in our society and our culture, is that younger and younger and younger people are getting into higher and higher positions of leadership. And I have nothing against smart young people shooting to the top and doing great things. However, I think we throw young people into the fire sometimes a little too soon. It's not that they don't have the intelligence to do it, maybe not even the competencies, but the experience maybe isn't there to know how to handle people. And handling people, and to turn us back to this toxic leadership, knowing how to handle people is the real issue in toxic leadership, in my mind. A toxic leader, at the end of the day, just doesn't know how to relate, doesn't know how to handle people. Knowing how to handle people, a lot of that just comes with experience.
You said a few interesting things much earlier in that run that you had there, because that was a good one. But I want to boomerang back and just highlight a couple of things. We discussed about setting up your future successor, and it's interesting because I did a live video, and that was one of the 3 points which I talked about in my live video today in my Moving Forward Leadership Mastermind.
And I didn't even watch it. So
no, you didn't even watch it. But organizations have two options when they're replacing someone, right? They can either promote from within, which everybody knows about, and that's kind of where you're leading at with everything you just talked about. But they can also hire from outside, right?
Yep.
So those obviously come with their advantages and disadvantages. So I just want to highlight that I found interesting, and we both have similar ideologies, and we talk about it the exact same day. And the second thing is, you discussed your experience in the U.S. Army, and I'm actually still actively serving in the Canadian Army up here as an officer. And I'm working on a master's thesis where I'm actually looking at our leadership training training system in the Canadian Forces, and it's very similar. It's trial by fire. It's a lot of here you go in the job and away you go. But I think it definitely highlights the need of that leadership training, that leadership training system formalized, so people do get, at least taught or informed of the different competencies that they're required as they move up through the rank structure. And that's what I'm looking at right now. So within the civilian organizations, I think this is where people start to stray. I think this is where a bit of the toxic leaders start to form because they just don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Half the time. And they just do what they see others are doing. And they don't recognize what the others are doing is actually toxic. Right? They just say, Mark is there. He's in the C-suite and he's treating everybody like garbage. He doesn't care. He'll employ scorched earth tactics. He's fired 5 people last week. Right? And that's how I need to act. And if we need to get away from this mentality because that's the boss mentality I've been talking about since I started this podcast.
No, I totally agree with you. I do think we oftentimes and toxic leaders, I think in particular, see themselves as the wise man on the mountaintop and everybody else is there to serve them. I'm the king, you're the servants. Whereas I think the non-toxic leader, the quote unquote good, great, or excellent leader is one who says, hey, we're collaborators in this thing. Yes, I serve in the role as your leader, but I'm not your boss. I'm not your dictator. I'm not the king and wise man on the mountaintop. I'm here to work with you to achieve the missions and the goals of our organization. I think that's one of the major differences between the two types of leaders.
Yeah, for sure. So for the leaders who are listening right now, what's your best advice for them to check themselves and determine, am I actually a good leader or am I a toxic leader? I think, my gut feel says that if they're a toxic leader, they wouldn't even listen to this podcast because they think they know it all. But let's get away from that assumption.
All right.
And what's your best advice to them? Say, okay, how do I check myself to see if I'm actually a toxic leader or not?
There's 2 things that I've always done as a leader, and I'm assuming that if any of the people that know me are listening, they would say I'm not a toxic leader, but I've striven, whatever, not to be a toxic leader. Anyway, the 2 things that I've tried to do in my life. Number 1, be real with myself. I think we all know in our heart of hearts if we're being toxic or not. If we're honest and introspective enough, we take a step back and look at how we're treating people, look at how we're operating, look at our relationships with colleagues and subordinates. We got to know to a certain extent that we're toxic or we're not toxic. I mean, I have been toxic at times, as we all have, I'm sure. And I know when I step back, I leave the office that night and I go, I really treated those people poorly today. I need to make amends for that tomorrow, or I need to go apologize to somebody, or whatever I need to do to make it right. I know at the end of the day when I've been a toxic leader and when I haven't. So I think we got to, number 1, get real. Number 2, and this is something that I've always had as a leader, every time I step into a new leadership position, I'll pull in 2 or 3, maybe 4, depending on the size of the organization, people that I trust, people that I know are wise. And this takes some time to develop. So it's not something you do day 1 of your new position, but maybe week 6 or 6 months into a new position, I'll have identified those people that seem to me to be wise, seem to me to have good ideas, seem to me to be the type of people that could be confidants in my life. And I'll bring those people in. They're subordinates sometimes, colleagues at other times, usually a mix. And I will sit them down and I will say, you have the authority any time of the day to call me, come in my office, shut the door, and be honest with me. No retribution, nothing. You can say anything you want to say. That door is closed. You can curse me out. You can tell me I'm the worst leader you've ever worked. Whatever you need to say to me to be honest and transparent so I know where I stand with you and with the other people in this organization. So that inner circle, as it were, of people that can be honest with you. So get real and have a group that holds you accountable within the organization. And I think that those are 2 safeguards that I've applied and I think could be very valuable for other leaders to keep you honest with yourself and hopefully away from this area of toxicity. Yeah. Of course, and just real quick, other things you can do obviously is always get a mentor, someone that you trust that's a good leader that has had good results, have that person mentor you, those types of things. But as far as accountability controls, getting real with yourself and having an inner circle.
The top is the loneliest place. Colin Powell said that once. But it doesn't have to be. Instead, you can find people to talk to, people to run ideas by, people to help you figure out solutions to the problems that you're facing right now as a leader. And see, I felt lonely once, and I decided to start the podcast. And with the podcast, I decided that I needed to help people like you more. So that's why I started the Moving Forward Leadership Facebook group. Leadership skills for managers to be leaders, not bosses. You can find it at movingforwardleadership.com/group. And come join us. It's completely free for you to join us and talk leadership with us day in, day out. So check us out again at movingforwardleadership.com/group. Now back to the show.
As far as accountability controls, getting real with yourself and having an inner circle.
I really like the inner circle thing. It's something I preach often because I for so many levels, but just to have those people come in, shut the door and go, what the frick are you talking about or doing, boss, or Scott or Mark or whatever the case may be, right? Because often, we kind of, our blinders kind of go on for whatever reason, depending on the situation. Sometimes blinders go on. It's hard. It happens to everybody. It happens to the best leaders. Sure. And you don't see the full vision, and all of a sudden you're doing something, you're saying something that you normally wouldn't necessarily do. Who knows? Maybe you had a rough night last night. Maybe your kid woke up at 3 a.m., throwing up. You're sleep deprived. You're not thinking straight. Yeah, something, someone cut you off in work or whatever, and you show up frustrated, and then you just kind of blow off the handle by accident. And like you said, it happens to all of us. It happens to all of us. But we do need that circle of people to come in, shut the door, and go, "What the heck are you doing? Is everything all right?" Or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
The listener is most likely a middle leader. Most of the audience is a middle leader. So they're kind of working on their leadership skills. They have a handful of people that they're in charge of now. They're not quite that VP or president level or C-suite level, right? They're those middle ones. So it's happened to me in the past when I've been in that role. I've been stuck in between my people and in between, my people and my boss is me, and I'm the one that's sheltering my people from that toxicity. What's your best advice out there for those leaders who today find themselves in that situation when they're just stuck? They got their people, they have their boss, and they're acting as that shield.
Well, that's not an easy place to be, obviously, because the shield gets the brunt of the impact. And, the people that are operating as shield, there's kind of that hero's mentality that, they're like, I've got to save these people. And, but as you've implied in your question, you've also got to save yourself too. I mean, you've got to be careful that you don't wipe yourself out in the instance of trying to protect everyone else. So to your question, what I did when I was in a situation, I won't be specific because I don't, that's probably not what you want, but I was in a situation where I was that person. I was sheltering people below me from the people above for quite some time, and it was hard. It was difficult. It was draining. However, what kept me going was, I have some inner resiliency. I think we've got to work on, and I won't go into all that, but you got to work on some ways outside of the workplace to build inner resiliency for yourself through spiritual practices, emotional practices, physical fitness, those types of things. You build your own resiliency, but I won't go into all that. But beyond that, in the workplace, I would say, you have to have that, again, a circle of people. And it's going to be a different circle than the one I talked about before. But a circle of people that you can go to kind of air your frustrations, seek advice. People that are kind of other people at your level who are probably doing the same thing for their people. In my situation, we had different divisions. I was in my division protecting my people, but my buddy in the next division over was doing the same thing. So he and I would get together, maybe commiserate sometime, but more than that, just, hey, what are you doing? How are you being treated? And when I heard him being treated the same way, and when I heard how he was dealing with it, heard how I was dealing with it, it helped us both weather those storms. And then we had several other people in other divisions that we did the same thing with, either individually or collectively. And it was fun. Sometimes we just get together and joke about it. And of course, humor helps you get through these things. But again, just like toxic leadership is a relationship problem, dealing with toxic leadership is a relationship issue as well. We got to relate with other people who are going through the same thing. Being in the military, and as I do, that you can deal with a lot of junk, a lot of crap when you have other people going through it with you. And so relationship is the key to all these things, I think. And that would be my primary answer to that question.
Yeah, having those people to vent to is definitely crucial, I've found throughout my experience. And I was in the same situation, right, as you. A toxic leader above me, go over and talk to my buddy who reported this story to this boss as well, and having the exact same conversations you did with your friend. And it's just good because one, it's kind of like a sanity check. It's like, am I going crazy? Am I actually like, is it the way I perceive it to be? And you talk to somebody else and they go, oh yeah, I get the same thing on my end. Like, okay, I'm not crazy. All right, someone else is. It's not us.
It helps. It really, mentally, emotionally, it helps. It really does. And then the other thing I would say, Scott, as a more proactive step, maybe, is now, and this is what I'm about to say. I can hear all the counter arguments to what I'm getting ready to say. So, but be willing to show courage and stand up to your bosses when need be. To show your subordinates, hey, he's willing to stand up. She's willing to stand up for me and do what's right. Because at the end of the day, that's what demonstrates a pure leader in my mind. A great leader are the ones that even at their own self-sacrifice and their own potential detriment, they stand up to do what's right. And sometimes that requires, going into the boss's office and saying, you know what, sir, ma'am, we're not, it's like the old, what was it, Twisted Sister song, we're not going to take it. No, we ain't going to take it anymore. And I'm being facetious there, but, standing up for what's right. And you've probably done that. I know in this situation I was describing a few minutes ago, I ended up doing that. I'll be completely transparent with you. At the end of the day, I had to leave the organization, but I did so with my head held high. Because I knew I did what was right and I protected the people below me. And to this day, 4 years later, I still get emails and calls and requests for lunches from the people that I work, because there are still stories about how I stood up to the man, as it were. And to me, that was a leadership success in my life. And I still look back on that with fond memories, even though I ended up having to leave the organization. I did what was right. And again, I know the counter arguments to that. People would say, yeah, but you lost your job. I actually resigned. I didn't lose the job. But at the end of the day, it was, a good, bad situation for me. It was good leadership for me. It was a good point of leadership for me, but it was, I had to leave my job and get something. But I'm in a better place now, so it's all good.
I actually agree with you.
Yeah.
I fully agree with you. There comes to a time and place when you need to stand up to those toxic leaders. And because maybe, like we talked about earlier, maybe they just don't know that they're a toxic leader in the first place.
That's true.
But often most toxic leaders don't give a shit that they're a toxic leader. Sorry to say it bluntly, but that's exactly right. But you need to stand up to them. So one of the last questions before we wind down here is, what's the best way to stand up to these toxic leaders out there? If you are that middle manager, that your boss is above you, is completely toxic, is destroying the organization, morale is crap, whatever the operational outputs of the organization, whether that's sales or revenue or whatever that is down, people are leaving, how do you go about standing up to that person and saying,
I think the
this
worst
place squared away?
I think the worst way to stand up to a toxic leader is to be a toxic follower, or to be a toxic complainer. What do I mean by that? If I roll into the boss's office, let's say I'm a middle manager and it's toxic. I've been sheltering my people for 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever. And I get fed up with it. I walk into the boss's office. I stick my finger in his chest and I say, you're a loser. I hate you. You're not the boss that that you need to be, and we're not taking this anymore. And da 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 da, and you start ranting and raving at the boss, it's not going to give you the results that you want. I think the best way to handle the toxic leader, because let's face it, toxic leaders oftentimes aren't angry, mean people running around and raving through the factory floor. I mean, honestly, that some do that, but oftentimes toxic leaders are very much smile in your face, stab you in the back type of people, right? They're kind of two-faced. So dealing with a toxic leader like that in a two-faced manner wouldn't be the way to do it either. I think here, so my point is this: calm, strategic, reasoned approach with that leader, walking into the office in a calm manner, setting up a meeting in a calm manner, and going in with your logical, laid out points, talking points that you want to go through, and sitting down and very calmly, respectfully, gracefully going through your points and saying, and having your ducks in a row, as it were, when you get in there. In other words, if you need, gather some statistics, gather some anecdotes. You might not want to put names to it, but gather some things that people are saying. Talk about the number of people. Get the data here. Here's, since you've been the leader or since you've been toxic, here's what's happened to productivity on the work floor or in the organization, and have all those data points and go through those things one by one, calm, collected, and reasonable. And at the end of the day, the toxic leader may shove you out of the office and say, get out of here. What are you talking about? You're wrong. But as you alluded to a few minutes ago, maybe they don't know they're being toxic, and maybe that'll open their eyes to their toxicity. Either way, you've done it well, and you won't have any regrets. And just as to finish off my story of the situation that I was in, this is what I did. And I didn't do it out of some major strategy like I'm talking about here. I just kind of did it because it's my personality. I walked in and I said, listen, there are some issues in this office, this headquarters office, that need to be dealt with that aren't being dealt with now. And I reasonably went through each of the things that I thought. Now, my toxic leader didn't respond well to that, but I left with my head high. I mean, I know without a shadow of a doubt that I did it right. That I went in there and I was not a toxic follower. I was not a toxic subordinate. I was a reasonable, grace-filled, kind, generous person, and I did the right thing. He didn't, and that's on him, not me. So,
I really like that whole thought process of showing up with facts, not emotions, right? Because I'll shoot a quick little story back at you, in which I did that exact same thing. I showed up to my toxic leader with all these facts and stuff like this, and I actually ended up getting an apology.
Nice.
Out of it. I didn't lose my job, didn't quit. I was ready to quit, didn't quit, but did get an apology out of that particular situation. Did that leader change themselves? No. They it wasn't like a euphoric moment where they suddenly stopped being toxic and started becoming the best boss I ever had. But at least I had that small win for a moment, right? At least I had that small win. So I was happy about that. And like you, it didn't matter what the outcome was going to be. All I knew was at least I could live with myself at the end of the day for doing what I felt was the right thing. And I think that's probably the most important thing there for the listener, is that you got, at the end of the day, you have to be able to live with yourself. And can you live with yourself day in, day out, from just sheltering your people from the crap that this toxic leader is pushing out? Or do you actually need to make that stand? And if you do need to make the stand, you need to be ready for those consequences, which could end up with you losing your job.
Good. And that's the unfortunate thing. But like you said, if we know we've done the right thing, then we'll be taken care of. Whether you believe in God or karma or whatever it is, things tend to work out.
For sure. Mark, this has been a super interesting talk. It's super important. Yeah. As we wind down, I got a couple last questions. The first one, which I ask all my guests here at Moving for Leadership podcast, and that is, according to you, Mark Tinsley, what makes a great leader?
Again, a collaborator. I think great leaders are collaborators. They don't see themselves as wise men on the mountaintop or women on the mountaintop. They're collaborators. Number two, they're innovators. They think outside the box. If if you're a leader and you're saying, hey, I'm just doing it the way we've always done it, then I would probably say you're not really a leader. You're a manager. Thinking outside the box and then just being a grace-filled person. I mean, you alluded to it a little bit ago, and I just want to elaborate on it very briefly, is that people are people. I have a principle of life. It's called people are people and you are people. People have bad days. We've got to have grace with other people and subordinates, colleagues, superiors alike. I mean, we've got to show that grace. So those are 3 things for me that make a good leader.
Awesome. And final question. Where can people find you? Where can they follow you? Feel free to give yourself a shameless plug, anything you're going on.
Yeah, I run my major online social media presence is through a radio station. I own an internet radio station that has a blog and a podcast and all kinds of stuff that goes along with it. It's called WLVADB. It's the radio station, The Crocodile actually is our mascot. And it can be found at www.thecrocradio.com. Again, it's blogs, podcasts. I have an internet video talk show podcast on there and things like that. So, thecrocradio.com.
Cool. And for the listener, as always, it's easy for you. Just go to movingforwardleadership.com/112. Mark, thanks again for coming out, taking your time to speak to me and my audience all about this crazy subject,
It is a crazy one, but it's a good one to talk about. Thanks for what you do, man.
Hey, thanks, you too. Take care.
Thank you.
All right, that's all I got for you fine folks today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed the interview. And most importantly, I hope you got something out of it. And if you did, remember, R², S², right? Rate and review the show so that it gets a little bit noticed, a bit more. But most importantly, I can help more people because that's what I'm here for. That's what my guests are here for, is to help more people become better leaders and not being bosses, right? So remember that. R², rate and review. S, share the show. Share this show with someone who you think can relate to the podcast as a whole and today's topic. And then finally, subscribe. Subscribe so that you never miss another episode. And you can do that via your podcast playing app of choice through movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. And as always, stop bossing and start leading. Take care now.